Hey guys, potentially long video today, so please bear with me, but hopefully it will be worth it in the end. A little bit of background. It was recently suggested to me that I need to start responding to low-level thinking believers. Apparently I need to make more serious responses to people like William Lane Craig. Now, I made a video in response to one of his blog posts before. It's not the best video of mine. I was still very new to making videos, I was new to talking about atheism, I was new to just responding to and refuting other people's points in videos. I think that video did pretty well in terms of views, but I'm not overly proud of it because I was still a beginner. Well, I'm still a beginner, but I was like a beginner, you know what I mean? Anyway, the person who told me all of this, apparently they doubt that I am prepared to argue against the strongest Christian minds on the planet. And I'll be honest, I don't think I'm ready for that yet. So instead I decided to respond to William Lane Craig. No, I'm just joking. But I do want to give a little bit of context to this particular video because I was doing a little bit of research on old Bill. Not Cool Bill, but you know, the other one. I have to say his videos are kind of dull. He can't seem to make anything under an hour long, and most of it's just him rambling, I guess, in a pretty uncharismatic way, and he doesn't really make it engaging, and But anyway, that's just my opinion. I don't know, I don't want to watch something for an hour if it's really dull, you know? But one thing I did pick up while sitting through a few of his videos was this argument he likes to make about same-sex marriage, or rather why he's against same-sex marriage. I found this clip of him saying this in 2016.
But Mark Regnerus, who is a professor at UT Austin, has done an extensive study of same-sex couples, and he has shown that the children who are raised in same-sex homes are significantly disadvantaged compared to children who are raised in homes that have a father and a mother. And Regnerus has endured enormous backlash, calls for his dismissal from the University of Texas. He's been denounced as bigoted and homophobic. But in fact, UT Austin reviewed his research methods and upheld their sociological integrity and credibility, and no one has been able to dispute Regnerus's results.
So I got thinking, I got researching, and two particular topics kind of stood out to me as being interesting and that I wanted to talk about. One of them was on the history of marriage in general, which will probably be tomorrow's video, because I want to do a little bit more research on it before I talk about it. And the other one was this study by, I don't know how to pronounce his name, but William Lane Craig says Regnerus, so that's what I'm going to say. If it's wrong, I'm sorry. So I went away and I had a look into this Regnerus study that he's talking about. So let's just summarize what's happening here. In 2016, William Lane Craig referenced a 2012 study by Mark Regnerus titled "How Different Are the Adult Children of Parents Who Have Same-Sex Relationships? Finding from the New Structure Study." Now, Mark is a sociology professor from the University of Texas at Austin, and his main fields of interest are sexual behavior, relationship dynamics, and religion. Thanks for that info, Wikipedia. Now, this particular piece of research, which was published in 2012, like I say, it played a pretty big role at the time around the legalization of gay marriage. Regnerus submitted it to courts and stuff to try and say, hey, look, this is why two consenting adults who love each other shouldn't be allowed to get married just because they're the same gender. For the last 30 years, research has been published suggesting that kids with gay parents are just as well off as others. But here was a piece of research being published in the Social Science Research Journal stating the exact opposite. Intriguing, right? I had to read this paper. Now, it turns out that the journal where this paper is published have a $40 paywall, and I don't exactly have that kind of money. So I decided to do a little bit of Googling, and I came across a link on Mark's website. Turns out he used to have the paper published on there, but it's not there anymore. The link annoyingly just led to a 404 page. And now, I'm not saying you should do this. I'm not saying I did this. But imagine you had a link to that paper, which may or may not be in the description below. And imagine you knew a website which saved copies of old web pages, which may or may not be in the description below. And imagine you put this link into that website, And now I'm not saying it's possible to read that paper that way, but if it was, I definitely wouldn't do it, and I wouldn't encourage anyone else to do it either. Anyway, by some magic I found this paper. And in this paper, Mark basically claims that compared to kids who are raised with both biological parents, what he likes to call intact biofamilies, kids who are raised with at least one gay parent are more likely to be screwed up in some way than regular kids. Pretty big accusation here. Like, this would be huge if it was true. But let's take a slightly more in-depth look at this paper, shall we? So for this study, Mark Regnerus uses data which he collected from the New Family Structures study, which he describes as a social science data collection project that fielded a survey to a large random sample of American young adults ages 18 to 35 who were raised in different types of family arrangement. Okay, coolsies, sounds good, sounds useful. He goes on to say that the study paid particular attention to reaching ample numbers of respondents who were raised by parents that had a same-sex relationship. The survey itself involved collecting data from just under 3,000 respondents, including 175 who reported their mother as having a same-sex romantic relationship, and 73 who said the same about their father. Not huge numbers, but okay, we can work with this. After determining a person's background, the survey went on to ask questions about the respondents' current social behaviours, health and relationships. So lots and lots of information being collected here. But let's have a look at how that data was collected a little bit closer. A company called Knowledge Networks was used to recruit an online research panel who were representative of the US population. Now, at the time in the US, it was estimated that there are around 580,000 same-sex households in the US. That's about 1% of all households. Among them, about 17% of them were thought to have kids. So that's about 0.17% of all US households are same-sex couples with kids. They ended up with a panel of just over 15,000 people who were then screened to try and get a representative sample group, which ended up being made of 3,000 people of all ages between 18 and 39. The screening process involved questions like, from when you were born until age 18, did either of your parents have a romantic relationship with someone of the same sex? And then there were a series of answers, and then they were asked questions about how long they lived with them, and so on. Out of the 3,000 people, they ended up interviewing further and asking, the questions about their lifestyle, their health, so on. 58% of the respondents have spent their entire youth with both their biological mother and father. 1.7% reported that their father or mother had a same-sex relationship during their childhood, and as mentioned before, this includes 175 lesbian mothers and 73 gay fathers. So we're actually getting a sample here that's a little bit, higher than the actual percentage of households in the US, but that's okay. The thing is, these are still small numbers, remember that. Other respondents were things like people from single parent households with step families, adopted families, and so on. So before I go any further and look at his results and conclusions, Regnerus himself admitted that his study had some weaknesses. He notes that it's not a longitudinal study. He notes that it clearly doesn't evaluate the offspring from same-sex marriages, which is a pretty big thing. And he also points out that the study was funded, at least in part, by the Witherspoon Institute and Bradley Foundation, who are both known for their support of conservative causes. Now, Regnerus tried to kind of brush this off a bit by saying in the paper, just as other private foundations are known for supporting more liberal causes, the funding sources played no role at all in the design or conduct of the study, the analysis, the interpretation of data, or in the preparation of this manuscript. So he just shrugs it off. He says they have no impact in the actual study. Although he doesn't actually mention the fact that he himself is a Catholic who vocally opposes gay marriage. So at this point I'm already getting kind of vibes of conflict of interest. The alarm bells are going off. But maybe he can stay impartial. He is a scientist after all, right? But let's have a look at little Marky's conclusions, shall we? Now, in the abstract of this article, he's pretty vague about his conclusions. He just claims that the results reveal consistent differences, especially between the children of women who have had a lesbian relationship and those with still married heterosexual biological parents. But once we look at the data, he starts to pick out some patterns and asserts that if you grow up with one or more homosexual parents, you're more likely to be unemployed, frequently use marijuana, drink the same or less alcohol, be more likely to smoke, have more sexual partners, be less likely to vote if your mum is gay, but way more likely to vote if your dad is gay. He also makes a point of looking at marital and cohabiting status, and this was something I found quite interesting. Now on the surface, it seems like cohabiting numbers seem higher for kids of gay parents and marriage numbers seem lower. But considering that these are both examples of committed relationships, I decided to add these numbers together a little bit and found that children of intact biofamilies are in these committed relationships 54% of the time. With a lesbian mother, it's 60% of the time. With a gay father, it's 56% of the time. And just for comparison, from single parent families, it was also 56% of the time. So these are all pretty even, to be honest. I'm not seeing much of a pattern here. They all seem to agree on, the same thing. They all follow the same patterns. Not really anything of significance to me. But the rest of it is basically just saying, look, differences. So now let me use this as evidence against gay marriage. And people like William Lane Craig come along, they look at this and say, look at this study, it was published, it's all true, read it, believe it, but only read the conclusions, don't question it. It's been questioned, but those people are monsters. Maybe it's a slight exaggeration, but that's kind of what he's saying. So at this point I was like, oh okay, this is actually quite interesting, this is some new information, a new study. But then I realised that William himself mentioned some criticisms.
Backlash, calls for his dismissal from the University of Texas. He's been denounced as bigoted and homophobic, and no one has been able to dispute Regnerus's results.
So I also had to go look this up, and it was good. Now, after this paper was published, according to good old Wikipedia, and I quote, 200 social scientists led by Gary Gates signed a letter to the editors and advisory editors of Social Science Research, the journal, in which they expressed their concerns about the academic integrity of the peer review process for this paper, as well as its intellectual merit. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. The most damning critique came in the form of a 2015 paper from Simon Cheng and Brian Powell, titled Measurement Methods and Divergent Patterns, Reassessing the Effects of Same-Sex Parents. And it was also published in the Social Science Research Journal. I like to think of this kind of as the journal publishing a correction to an earlier article. Now, annoyingly, I couldn't find this paper in full online anywhere, not even with some magic tricks. But I did read several extracts from a number of websites and news articles and got a decent idea, but sadly without being able to read it in full, I'm still somewhat skeptical. I don't fully accept it 100% because I haven't read it for myself. But from what I have read, it does seem pretty sound at the moment, but I'm willing to be proven wrong. In summary, the Cheng and Powell paper says, taking a closer look at the new family structure study, we demonstrate the potential for misclassifying a non-negligible number of respondents as having been raised by parents who had a same-sex romantic relationship. They actually reanalyzed Regnerus's raw data and found that, and again I quote, the empirical patterns in the original article were so fragile that they appear largely a function of these possible misclassifications and other methodological choices. Ooh, big words, hard to say. They warn that even a tiny percentage of measurement errors from the small subsamples could powerfully distort patterns from the survey. So what does all this mean? Basically, Regnerus screwed up. He didn't check his raw data properly for the possibility of inconsistent, uncertain, and unreliable cases. Powell and Cheng also suggested there was a big case of misclassification of some data. So for a start, let's talk about this misclassification thing. Let's look at what it means to be raised by a gay parent. To me personally, it would make sense that this definition would mean living with a parent with a same-sex partner for the bulk of your childhood. But to Regnerus, it just meant that at some point in the first 18 years of their life, at least one of that person's parents had a same-sex partner at some point. Cheng and Powell, when they reanalyzed this data, they were a little bit more lenient with their definition than me, but definitely more accurate than Regnerus was, and they said that it was to do with a parent having a same-sex partner for at least a year and the child living with them. So when looking at Regnerus's data, Cheng and Powell found that over half of the 236 respondents in question had never actually lived with their parents' same-sex partner, and almost 1/3 had never or only briefly lived with their gay parent. And in fact, 53 of those people lived with their gay mother or father for less than 1 year. So not very long at all. Regnerus also didn't take into account joke answers, and I find this so strange because one of the first things you're taught when you're dealing with any large set of data is to look for outliers and look for ones which could be just, the result of some error. Or in the case of dealing with like answers from real people, you look for the joke answers, the stupid answers, the ones who have purposely answered incorrectly. So the fact that Regnerus didn't do this just kind of blows my mind because I was taught this from the age of like 17. So the fact he did this when we're dealing with such small numbers of people means that they could have very, very easily skewed the data. And it turns out that they did. Remember, out of the 3,000 people, only 73 said they had a gay father. And with numbers that small, a couple of people, a couple of outliers, they can seriously mess up a pattern or a trend. So the 25-year-old who said that he was a 7'8" man with a gay dad and 8 wives and 8 children, he probably wasn't real. Just a guess. And that probably messed up the data pretty considerably. So Cheng and Powell, they took all this raw data, they threw out the joke answers, they reanalyzed the data, changing the definition and classification of what it means to be raised by same-sex parents, and found that out of the 236 respondents identified by Regnerus as living in a lesbian mother or gay father household, only 51 of them can actually plausibly be coded as being raised for at least a year in a same-sex couple household. Very different numbers there. So with this new analysis of the data, turns out there weren't really all the big significant differences that Regnerus claimed there were. In fact, they warned that even the 4 particular differences that they picked out, Cheng and Powell, they were based on what they described as highly fragile patterns influenced by a couple of influential cases or outliers, and that with such a small sample it was difficult to draw any real statistical conclusions from it. Basically, they concluded that when equally plausible and in our view preferred methodological decisions are used, a different conclusion emerges. Adult children who lived with same-sex parents show comparable outcome profiles to those from other family types, including intact biological families. Basically, kids who were raised by gay parents don't turn out any different from any other kid. That's the conclusion they drew from this. So we're using a more reliable method, we're using more accurate data, and this study is backed up by 30 other years of research. Seems like this is a more reliable and accurate conclusion, wouldn't you say? Plus, Cheng and Powell didn't really have anything to lose or gain by proving or disproving this paper. Unlike Regnerus, they're not, like, vocally pro-gay marriage. Regnerus was very, anti-gay marriage and very conservative and funded by conservatives, so there's clearly, I'm not saying there was a bias there, but there's a very strong possibility of bias there. Interestingly, after I read the Cheng and Powell article, I went on to find a little kind of blog post style article that Regnerus himself wrote in response. Funnily enough, he thanks the researchers for pointing out his mistakes by including joke responses. If I was him, I'd be a little bit more embarrassed, but whatever. However, he does go on to criticize them. To quote his article, he actually says, "The data will often say anything you'd like them to say if you just adjust and justify how you analyze them." Excellent point! But isn't that just what he himself did in the first place? He's known for being anti-gay marriage and his research was funded by conservatives, so wasn't it in his best interests for there to, be a certain outcome? So what can we conclude from this? Well, these are kind of more personal conclusions rather than anything else. They're not really fact-based and not whatever. To be honest, more than anything, just highlights how complex of an issue raising kids is and how much affects them, and it's not just one thing or another or who your parents happen to be. And let's be honest, marriage is about more than just kids. You can be married without kids, you can be married with 1 million kids. Either way, it's still marriage, and it's still about whatever you want it to be about. Personally, I still thoroughly support gay marriage and believe that neither article really holds a key place in arguing for or against it. But all that said, if I was to trust one over the other, I would go with the Cheng and Powell article, just because it makes more sense, and there were some big, glaringly obvious mistakes in the Regnerus article. And to be honest, they do make me question a lot of the other bits of research he's done, and I'm not sure how willing I'd be to want to listen to him or his conclusions in the future. A couple of other things that I kind of take away from this are that I don't think William Lane Craig is a genius. Not as much as some people think he is. But that's just more my opinion. He seems pretty fond of cherry-picking whatever research he wants to champion and then just booing the critics, even when the critics are pretty legit, as in this particular case. But anyway, that's just me. I'd like to know what you think on this issue. Have you read these articles? And if so, what do you think of them? What do you think about this whole debate in general? Obviously, I'm all for gay marriage, and if you're not, then I really don't understand why not. Sorry if this has been a really long video. I know I kind of suck at doing that recently. I want to try and get some shorter videos out, and I will do it eventually. But for now, there's just a lot I want to talk about, I guess. But anyway, if you've made it through this far, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it, and I'll see you again soon.